Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship, and that is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Notice what Paul does first. The first thing he does is he shows them, I know who you are. I've looked around, I've seen these things about you. In fact, maybe there's even some common ground here. I see that you're religious, me too. I see that you have all these gods. In fact, there's this one God that you say it's an unknown God. Man, I can connect these dots for you. Let me help. What he didn't do is he didn't start negative. He didn't begin by berating them for having too many gods, or scold them for not holding the right beliefs, or be angry with them for living ungodly lives. And again, this was the Manhattan and the Los Angeles of the world, maybe more like Las Vegas. I mean, this was Sin City. And he came in there and he didn't start by taking a position of authority and telling them everything they did wrong. Rather, he built a bridge and said, look, there's this part of you, there's this part of your culture that I can speak into. You're not far. You're right here. Let me connect the dots for you. And I wonder how often in our own rhetoric, we tell someone, hey, you're not far. You're closer than you think. Closer maybe than I think. You have something here. God is doing a work. Let me show you what it is. Let me point it out to you. How different would our conversations be if instead of responding in anger to someone, or just blasting whatever it is in the open that we're angry about, we came from a position of walking alongside and saying, hey, there's part of this. Let me show you who God is through your very own culture. Verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. There's a lot going on here. What Paul is telling the Areopagus, we could dissect this. It could take forever. It's already taken forever. So let's not do that. I want to look at some big pictures of what Paul is talking about. I want to just look at the 30,000-foot view. And what Paul is doing here is that he is telling them that this God who you say is an unknown God, he's big. He's bigger than you can imagine. He's bigger than any of the other gods that you worship. In fact, he created this whole thing. He didn't share the creation with anyone else except for this one man who he resurrected. Let me get to him in a minute. But he is big. He is magnificent. He alone created this, and nothing that we make can contain him. In the ancient world, they made temples and shrines to contain gods, and they would go to worship those gods. But Paul says that nothing we make can contain him. Let me give you a little snippet of how we do this today. What we do today, we don't go to temples and worship statues, but we create structures and systems and ideologies that are made with our own minds. And we begin to put those things on display. And those are what inform our faith. And those are the most important things. And what happens when we begin to think that we have this corner market on who God is, and when we have this corner market and we can contain God, is that we begin to put God in a box. We begin to define how God can operate and how he will operate. And we begin to define the types of people who are inside that box and the ways in which God works and the people in which God works through. And then what ends up happening is that we make God really small. Because if our ideas can contain God, then God is just in our image. We've created a God that's in our image, and we are quite small. When we limit God to our own ideas and our own tribes and our own sides, what we do is we present a small God to our world. And the world doesn't want to follow a small God. I mean, that's what the world thinks of themselves. That's what our culture teaches. You're basically God to yourself. It's a small God. What the world needs is a big God who can work in big ways, who can work in ways that we can't even imagine. And when the culture looks at us in our little corners, holding on to God and defining how God can work and who God will work with, they say, that's a small God. I don't need that. I don't want any part of that. But our God is so much bigger than our own understanding and our own ideas and the lines that we draw and the tribes that we associate with. God is so much greater than that. Verse 27. God did this. So God created all this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Though he is not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Again, Paul is taking their culture, their own writings, and connecting the dots and saying, look, you guys aren't far from this. In fact, your own poets have alluded to this God who you are his offspring. That means that God is close to you. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. First, God is big, so much bigger than any of the Athenian gods. But secondly, God is personal. God is personal. He is deeply involved in our lives. He did this, he created this, he put himself on display so that we would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. He wants us to find him. The Greek gods, they were prickly. You ever read Greek mythology? They were temperamental, they were angry. They didn't really have any use for mankind other than that mankind would appease them and bring them gifts and offerings. But God flipped that. He created this world so that we would seek him, so that we would draw near to him. But then when that wasn't happening, guess what he did? He sent a man to the earth to die and be raised from the dead. He saw us. He is personal in so many ways. And Paul says these words that I think should be near to our lips anytime we begin to talk about God with somebody else. He says, he is not far from any one of us. And he says that to these Stoics and these Epicureans who, by our standard, would have been really far from God. They would have been really far from God, and yet Paul says he's not far from any one of us. He's not far from you. He's not chilling on some throne somewhere, uninterested, uninvested in our lives. But he's deeply interested, deeply invested, and he cares about you. God is big, but he's personal. Verse 30. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. At least one person from the cultural elite became a follower, and many others did too. How amazing is that? That God used a situation that was less than ideal and brought into his family those who could be difference makers. But it says that they were disturbed at his talk about this man being raised from the dead, the resurrection. And we talked about that because if the resurrection is true, then that means their philosophies of self needed to be stripped away to follow this man who was resurrected. So this disturbed them. They would have to change their entire philosophy. Let's wrap this up. I think, that we have lost our way with evangelism, and we have lost a lot of influence in our world. Not just because of some outside forces, but because we have lost our vision to be missionaries, even in our own land. We have lost the missionary mindset. And what I want to do next week is unpack what that looks like. What is this missionary mindset that we have to have? Because friends, we live in a mission field with people who are searching for truth and people who are searching for pleasure and knowledge in all the wrong places. And we have something that we can offer to people, but we've lost our missionary calling. And I would say that the missionary calling is to observe and inform culture's longing. Let me unpack that for you. Our calling as missionaries is to observe culture's longing. We need to be looking around and seeing what people are placing their trust in, seeing what people are worshiping, seeing what people are looking to for hope. And we observe those things and we can name those things. But we're separate from it. We're not a part of that. We're living in it. And yes, we are in the world, but we are not of the world. And so we separate ourselves from it so that we can inform their longing. Hey, I've looked around and I see this, man. How did Paul play this out? The thing that the Athenians were searching for really was knowledge. They wanted to be the most knowledgeable society in all of the world. That's why they were big on philosophy. That's why they debated all the time, presented new ideas. And so Paul looked at them and he said, look, you've been searching for knowledge your whole life, but 2 times in this little segment, he says, but you've been ignorant. You've been searching for knowledge this whole time, but you've been ignorant. See, the first thing that the gospel does is it confronts the idols, the idolatry of our culture and of our world. The gospel does confront that. And says, this is what you've been searching for, but it's not landed you where you thought it would, has it? But then the second thing that the gospel does is it fulfills the deepest longings of that idolatry. So Paul says, you've been searching for knowledge, but you have not found it. You've been, in fact, you have a God that you can't even name. You've been ignorant of these things. But let me tell you that this great big God who is also personal, when you seek and find him, you will find greater knowledge than you could imagine. What you've been searching for is knowledge, but you won't find it outside of this great, big, personal God. Because Paul looked around at what his culture worshiped, and he was able to call it out and say, this is what you've been searching for. Let me tell you how Jesus fulfills that. Not everything that you've done wrong, but how Jesus is fulfilling the very thing that you're looking for. So our missionary call is to observe the world. What is it that makes our culture tick? What are the longings of our culture? What are people putting their trust in? I mean, if we don't know that, then how can we present a gospel that is desirable for the world?